Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And today I'm on the hot seat. I'm going to get asked the question. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. We answer your questions about work. And then we also put our past responses here at thisisnotadvice.work. And I'm excited to have Spencer with me today because Spencer, just until a month or two ago, was officially a student in the course that I teach at Berkeley's business school at Haas. That course is about the media industry. And Spencer, like a lot of people in that class, had some significant professional experience before Yelp, Google Cloud, et cetera, and is exploring interests in other areas. So Spencer, what's the question we got today?
Yeah, Roy. So the media industry in general is very, it's a lot about who you know. It's a very kind of dense, I guess, insular community. And so how can I get to know people in an industry where I don't really know anybody?
Yeah, I would say, by the way, that's not just true of media, although it is
Right.
particularly true of media. In my experience, it's actually the norm, unfortunately, with the exception of two kinds of roles. The exceptions are the roles for which there are, well, both of these, this is the case, where there's a well-defined high volume application process. And I was going to say there's two kinds. One is the big funnel role, like I want to go be a barista at Starbucks.
Right.
And the other is where there's a recruiting relationship established with a particular institution, either an employer or school. But most of the most interesting jobs are not like that. Okay, so the way that I think about it is there's two elements of this task. The first element is research, of figuring out who you want to know. And the other is connection, is figuring out how to establish some working relationship with them. And they don't happen in sequence. They happen, obviously the research tends to happen more first, but they blend with one another as they go. And so the first step is just figuring out, who do I want to know? And the tendency most people have here is to go after visible names. LinkedIn and trade publications are such valuable resources because it's like, hey, if I'm interested in, learning how to make an amusement park ride, like going to the CEO of Six Flags is probably a thing a bunch of people have done. Going to the head of Imagineering at Disney is probably a thing a bunch of people have done. But finding somebody who may be in a position to relate more directly to that role, who's recently been in it, and who has, and this can be as flimsy as you need it to be, and who has some point of personal connection with you. And of course, here we are, two white guys speaking to each other, two guys who went to good schools, speaking to each other. Obviously, the fewer advantages and privileges you have, the harder that is. But sometimes it can be as thin as, hey, I saw you wrote this thing, and I have been thinking about that for years, and like just doing it in a genuine way. So that's kind of the research. And then the outreach, the way I think about it is, imagine yourself in that person's shoes. Or in their inbox, how would you receive the thing? And I think there's a lot of well-intentioned advice out there, which just is stupid in practice. Like, I'll give you an example. The core thing is try to show up in a way that's palatable to them, i.e. they can digest it, but also potentially useful in some way. And if it's a cold outreach, like you're writing them on LinkedIn or figuring out how to get their email, well, then the bar goes up. And if it's a warm outreach, then the bar goes down a little bit. But one well-intentioned sentiment is to try to be useful to the person.
Right.
The problem is that the way that's usually done is so thin. Like, I'll get these LinkedIn pings that are like, and I know a bunch about X, so if you'd like to get coffee and pick my brain. And it's like, well, I don't know. You don't know if that person wants to sit down with you for 15 minutes. And by the way, like, whoever did anything useful in 15 minutes? So I would just experiment with different things. And so it could just be something, a frequent example is somebody wants to crack into the movie business, which is not something I know a ton about how to do, but I've been around it because there's so many people who want to do it. And it's like, well, here I did a detailed dissection of 60 seconds of a scene that you shot. Something like that shows you've really done the work, because I think one of the principles that works, and then I'll be quiet, I would love to hear any questions or thoughts you have, is the principle of reciprocity. There's this old book by Cialdini called Influence, which, while a lot of it is outdated, I do think it's a useful way to think about things. And reciprocity is like, look, I just did this work for you. It does create a sentiment of like, well, I'd at least like to be responsive to this person. I mean, they did something for me. And the more automated you are in it, the more you're spamming a bunch of people with the same message. That doesn't work. You need to both be mass and be custom at the same time. So those are a few thoughts and reflections that are general, but I don't know how that lands in your specific case or how you think about it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's really helpful especially for trying to establish that connection once found. Now, a little bit on finding that connection to begin with, right?
Yeah.
LinkedIn, I feel like, has this tendency to be by default transactional, it seems like, right? So maybe there's a bit of a need of change in platform when reaching out for these connections, because it's not always about wanting a job.
That's right.
Or at
The
least
place you find them and
right?
the place you reach out to them is not necessarily the same. And sorry, just to interrupt for a second, I'll also just say, finding people who seem to be more comfortable with somewhat more public awareness of their work. If you find somebody who's got an Instagram account that seems pretty professional, maybe that's a place to find them. I don't know, but that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe in part it's a need to change to Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah, Twitter can be great for outreach. Email is such a good default, and a good skill to learn is the skill of figuring out people's email addresses.
Yeah, that's a bit of sleuthing that I need to work on to build that skill.
There are also online services where you can do lookups, or you find somebody else who works at the place and you figure out the naming convention. I mean,
So then when trying to find that right person to connect with, one thing that can be a struggle is titles are opaque. So if you find someone who, say, has a title of digital strategy manager at, say, like a Disney or a Six Flags, that can mean anything from social media, they handle all the social media, to they do digital transformations in the park. And not everyone is as rigorous in having explanations underneath their LinkedIn for experiences. So sussing that out can be really difficult. Do you have any kind of additional advice or context in how to do that investigative groundwork or legwork?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessary to have too much precision. You're not trying to do the research to find the perfect person. You're trying to find a plausible person who seems closely enough connected, and then you're guessing at it. You want to avoid writing to 8 people in the same group, because what you don't want is like, did you get that weird message from that Spencer dude? All showing up at the same time. But I think that I look at other cues, like what kind of work had they been doing previously? Like their most recent title might be opaque, but the list of titles in context may be less opaque. Right. I'd look at other people who have that role title in the same organization and what kinds of things have they done. And so you triangulate a little bit. And while I'm a really big fan of customizing and being thoughtful in the outreach, it's also worth just recognizing that you may not know. And sometimes, by the way, now let's just talk about the role of an intermediary in the connection, because sometimes, especially if you've gone to a school that like a bunch of smart people have gone to, you may find somebody who's another Haas alum or something like that who's willing to connect you. And sometimes the difference between saying, hey, you're a Haas alum, you work at Six Flags, do you know anybody who does X? Well, that's putting 2 requests on the person. That's putting both the request for the introduction and the cognitive request of, can you think of the person, which is oftentimes the harder part. But if you say, hey, and I looked up and it looks like there's this person whose job title is X, and she seems like she could be the right person. Is she the right person? Even if the answer is no, and they have to find somebody else, the very fact you were willing to try to make it easy for them, by the way, the answer might be yes, does reduce the burden to them to taking action.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. Taking some of the legwork off of them and just lowering that barrier to entry.
Yeah. And by the way, lightweight relationships can also be okay, because I guess I left out a third part, which is, you do the research, you do the outreach, and then you actually have to build the relationship and get to know them. And sometimes that's just like, it can be, I have deep business relationships that started out with Twitter DMs back and forth, where we had like 3 or 4 DMs. And yeah, I maybe couldn't get the person a job right away, but sometimes these things just take time and they have a natural cadence. You can't rush relationship building.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on one more thing you said earlier, right? You were saying, we were using the example of the movie industry, and if you wanted to dissect a 60-second piece of film of a director or somebody at some level. I have pet projects that I like to work on across media and entertainment, sports, and they're industry related or they're tangentially related, but there's always this lingering fear of, does this hit some sort of benchmark, or is it too pedestrian, or what? And so when do you feel comfortable kind of bringing that to the table to show to somebody who does have all this experience?
Because sometimes that can be the thing. I think the answer is you have to do some trial and error, and then to look at other examples elsewhere. If it's a media product, for example, you've got a screenplay. Well, you've got resources like The Blacklist that have tons and tons of screenplays, and you can just try to figure out, where does my thing stack up? But honestly, part of what that person may be assessing is your own internal notes. And it's a very different thing to say, hey, I've got this fully polished scene that I've written, versus here's my second try at something. I've put a bunch of work into it. I'm not quite sure if I have the beat cadence right, or I don't know, something. Right. And you are willing to identify that specific moment. And again, what it suggests, because of all the trial and error and the fact you can't rush relationship building, is this also may just take time. It may not happen on the timeline of your job search.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially in some of these industries where it's, just in time hiring, right? You only have those roles come up.
Yeah, it's a good point. Often. I mean, I would say that actually, the roles that tend to be the big volume roles, particularly with recruiting relationships, are also the roles that tend to have a hire in advance kind of a thing of like, well, we talk to you, and then not years later, but like, we'll hire you in May for a job in September. Whereas most things are not like that. And, we're hiring for a role on the Bloomberg beta team right now. It is as soon as you can fucking start. It may take us some time to find the person, but I think that's another reason why taking time is a good idea. And also why sometimes those kinds of searches are often easier to do out of school than in school. Because when you're in school, or you start doing the work while you're still in school, and we've had people do that. In fact, we just hired Amber Yang, and she started working with us before she had graduated to overcome that timing mismatch issue. So that must have been punishingly hard for her for a short period of time, but that's what she had to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think on kind of the last point, and just any recommendations for, structuring things, especially pet projects, in such a way that it's easy to digest, or you want to take, like you were saying earlier, you want to take as much burden off of the person of work as possible. So like maybe following more of a non-traditional structure to the industry standard to try to make it digestible for them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I'd just say it depends a lot on the specific context. It depends. Some people in certain roles are more tech forward. So like sending them a cloud app or a Loom video could go a long way. Some people it's just not like that. And it's more like, something you need to show them in person. And so you just have to try to be. One thing all this research does is it can make you more sensitive to the particular context, including word choice and what language people use. And, the cool thing is basically any occupation now, you can find a lot of information from somebody in that occupation anywhere on the internet. And so don't ask your precious new relationship a question that you could have asked Google.
That's a great point.
And guess at it. But I mean, trial and error, give it a long time, do your research. Don't try to apply some cookie cutter formula. If you're doing a cookie cutter thing, chances are you won't get a cookie.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that, Roy.
All right. Any other questions or thoughts on this one?
I think that's all for the moment.
All right. Well, I'm going to put up for a second. This is actually the URL, since we were talking about it, for the job for which we are hiring. So I'll give that a second. And obviously, Spencer, if you know anybody. And then just a reminder for folks who are watching for the first time, the reason we call it This Is Not Advice is because I don't know, Spencer doesn't know what the specific thing is you should do in your circumstance. Advice is so much assumption. And we just want folks to try their own way. And we're just sharing our experiences. You can find past episodes, some just the video recordings, some where we've gotten a written up transcript. For a few hundred, we've got a written up transcript actually at thisisnotadvice.work. And, Spencer, good luck. And I'm just excited that we get to continue to be in touch even after the class is over. That really matters to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Roy. I appreciate your time. This was